In just 42 seconds, one of Hollywood's most respected actresses went from smiling on the couch to standing up, ripping off her microphone, and storming off set while cameras were still rolling. A fiery argument erupted that left the studio audience completely silent, crew members frozen in shock, and Graham Norton red-faced with anger as Meryl Streep called him out on live television before making her dramatic exit. Last night's episode started like any other show. The lights were bright, the audience was excited, and Graham Norton sat in his chair ready to chat with one of the biggest names in movies. Meryl Streep walked out wearing a beautiful blue dress, waving to the crowd as they clapped and cheered. She sat down on the famous red couch, crossing her legs and smiling at Graham. Everything seemed perfectly normal. The band had just finished playing, and Graham leaned forward with his cards in hand, ready to start the conversation. "Meryl, wonderful to have you here," Graham said. But there was something in his voice that didn't sound quite right. It was a bit too sharp, a bit too fake. Meryl noticed it too. Her smile became a little smaller, but she nodded politely. "Thank you for having me, Graham," she replied, her voice calm and professional. Graham shuffled his cards and looked down at them. "So, I've been reading some things about you lately," he started, and the way he said it made a few people in the audience shift uncomfortably in their seats. "There's been quite a bit of talk about your recent comments on the film industry. Some people are saying you've become a bit difficult to work with." The audience went quiet. That wasn't the kind of question anyone expected. Meryl's eyebrows went up slightly, and she tilted her head. "Difficult?" she repeated, her voice still controlled but with a hint of surprise. "That's an interesting way to start an interview, Graham." Graham laughed, but it wasn't a nice laugh. It was the kind of laugh someone makes when they think they're being clever. "Well, it's what people are saying. You've turned down several major projects. You've spoken out against certain directors, and there are rumors that you demanded script changes on your last film." "That sounds pretty demanding, doesn't it?" Meryl straightened up in her seat. The friendly look on her face was starting to fade. "Graham, I think you're confusing having standards with being difficult. When I speak about issues in the film industry, I'm talking about important things like fair pay, respectful working conditions, and quality storytelling. If that makes me difficult, then I'm proud to be difficult." But Graham wasn't backing down. He leaned back in his chair with a smirk on his face. "Right, but some would say that at your age, maybe you should just be grateful for the roles you're still being offered. Hollywood isn't exactly kind to older actresses, is it? Perhaps you should be a bit less picky." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Several audience members gasped quietly. Meryl's face changed completely. The polite smile was gone, replaced by a look of disbelief and anger. "Excuse me," she said, her voice now sharp as a knife. "Did you just tell me I should be grateful? And what exactly did you mean by 'at your age'?" Graham shifted in his seat, realizing he might have pushed too far, but instead of apologizing, he doubled down. "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking, Meryl. You're not a spring chicken anymore. Maybe it's time to be a bit more humble about the opportunities you get." Meryl stared at him for a long moment. The studio was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. "Graham, I've been in this industry for over 40 years, she said slowly, her voice filled with controlled anger. "I've won more awards than I can count. I've worked with the greatest directors in the world, and I've earned every single bit of respect I have. The fact that you think you can sit there and tell me to be humble because of my age shows exactly what's wrong with people like you." Graham's face was starting to turn red. He didn't like being challenged, especially not on his own show, in front of his own audience. "People like me?" he shot back. "What's that supposed to mean? I'm just asking the questions that viewers want to know." "No, you're not," Meryl interrupted, her voice getting stronger. "You're being disrespectful, and you're using my age and my opinions as a way to try and embarrass me on live television. That's not journalism, Graham. That's just mean." The audience was completely frozen. Some people looked shocked. Others looked like they wanted to disappear into their seats. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every second of the confrontation. Graham's producers were probably panicking in the control room, but there was nothing they could do to stop what was happening. Graham stood up from his chair, pointing his finger at Meryl. "Now hold on just a minute," he said, his voice rising. "This is my show, and I'll ask whatever questions I damn well please. If you don't like it, Maybe you shouldn't have agreed to come on. Meryl stood up too, facing him directly. She was shorter than Graham, but in that moment, she seemed 10 feet tall. You invited me here under false pretenses, she said, her voice echoing through the studio. I thought I was coming on to talk about my work, my craft, and maybe have a few laughs. Instead, you've spent the last several minutes trying to tear me down. Why would you do that, Graham? What did I ever do to you? Graham crossed his arms over his chest. You've been criticizing the industry for months, Meryl. You've made comments about hosts and interviewers, about how we don't ask serious enough questions. Well, here's a serious question for you. Do you think you're better than everyone else? That's not a serious question, Meryl fired back. That's an insult disguised as a question. And you know what? I do think I'm better than this. She gestured around the studio, at Graham, at the whole situation. I'm better than participating in whatever this ambush is supposed to be. The tension was reaching a breaking point. Graham took a step closer to Meryl, his face now bright red with anger. You think you can come on my show and insult me? He practically shouted. You think you're so special that you can just say whatever you want? This is exactly the entitled attitude people are talking about. Meryl didn't back down. She stood her ground, looking Graham right in the eyes. Entitled? You're calling me entitled? Graham, you literally just told me I should be grateful for scraps because I'm getting older. You're the one who thinks you can treat people however you want, just because you have a television show. That's the definition of entitled. The audience didn't know what to do. Some people were looking at each other with wide eyes. Others had their hands over their mouths in shock. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was a real fight happening right in front of them. And it was getting worse by the second. Graham pointed toward the exit. You know what, Meryl? If you don't like how I run my show, maybe you should leave. Nobody's forcing you to stay here. Meryl laughed, but there was no humor in it. Oh, I'm leaving, Graham. Don't worry about that. But before I go, I want everyone watching to understand something. She turned slightly, looking at one of the cameras. This is what happens when interviewers care more about creating drama than having real conversations. This is what happens when someone thinks they can disrespect you just to get ratings. And this is what happens when you stand up for yourself, instead of just sitting there and taking it. She reached up and grabbed her microphone, the small one that was clipped to her dress. With one quick movement, she yanked it off, the wire pulling free from the battery pack at her waist. She held it out toward Graham. Here, you won't be needing this anymore, because I'm done. Graham's face was now a mixture of red anger and white shock. You can't just walk off my show, he yelled. We're in the middle of taping. Watch me, Meryl said calmly. She dropped the microphone on the couch cushion, and it made a small thump that echoed through the speakers. The sound guy in the control room probably cringed at that, but nobody cared about technical details anymore. But Graham wasn't finished. As Meryl started to turn away, he grabbed her arm. Wait just a damn minute, he said, his grip tight. You don't get to make me look like the bad guy here. Meryl looked down at his hand on her arm, then back up at his face. Her eyes were ice cold. Let go of me, Graham, she said quietly, but there was steel in her voice. Right now, the audience gasped. A few people even shouted, Let her go, from their seats. Graham's hand dropped immediately, and he took a step back. He seemed to realize in that moment that he had crossed a serious line. Putting his hands on a guest like that was not okay, and everyone in the studio knew it. I didn't mean, Graham stammered, but Meryl cut him off. Yes, you did, she said. You meant every bit of this. The questions about my age, the comments about being difficult, telling me to be grateful, and now grabbing me. This whole thing was designed to humiliate me, wasn't it? Did you think I would just sit there and take it? Did you think I would smile and laugh and let you make a fool out of me? Graham's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. For once, the famous talk show host had nothing to say. His confidence had completely evaporated, and he just stood there looking lost and angry. Meryl shook her head. I've been doing interviews for decades, Graham. I've dealt with tough questions, controversial topics, and challenging conversations. But I've never, in all my years, had someone treat me with such blatant disrespect. And you know what the sad part is? You probably thought you were being clever. You probably thought this would make great television. She started walking toward the exit, her heels clicking on the studio floor. The sound seemed incredibly loud in the silent room. Graham finally found his voice again. "This is ridiculous," he called after her. "You're being oversensitive. Can't you take a joke?" Meryl stopped walking. She turned around slowly, and the look on her face made even the crew members take a step back. "A joke?" she repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. "You think ageism is a joke? You think disrespecting someone's career and grabbing their arm is funny? Graham, the only joke here is you. That did it." Graham completely lost his temper. "Get out," he screamed, his face twisted with rage. "Get the hell off my stage. You think you're so much better than everyone else? Fine. Leave. We don't need you." "I was already leaving," Meryl said calmly, which somehow made Graham even angrier. "But thank you for proving my point. This is who you really are, Graham. Not the charming host with the funny stories. This angry, insecure man who can't handle being challenged." Graham picked up his note cards and threw them across the studio. They scattered everywhere, fluttering through the air like snow. "I've had enough of this," he shouted. "Security, get her out of here." But Meryl was already walking away. She didn't run, didn't storm off in a panic. She walked with her head held high, moving toward the exit with complete dignity. The audience watched in stunned silence as one of the greatest actresses of all time left the stage. Just before she reached the door, she turned back one more time. "Good luck with the rest of your show, Graham," she said. And even though her voice was calm, everyone could hear the disappointment in it. "I hope it was worth it." And then she was gone. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and the studio erupted into chaos. Audience members were talking all at once, some standing up from their seats, others pulling out their phones. The cameras were still rolling, capturing Graham as he stood in the middle of the stage, breathing hard, his hair messed up from running his hands through it. He looked at the audience, at the cameras, at his crew. Everyone was staring at him, and not in a good way. People looked shocked, disappointed, even angry. This wasn't how the show was supposed to go. This wasn't entertainment. This was a disaster. "Well," Graham finally said, trying to force a laugh that came out shaky and weak, "that was unexpected." He looked around for support, but nobody was smiling. The audience just stared at him in silence. One woman in the front row shook her head and looked away. Graham's producer was probably screaming in his earpiece, but he just stood there, realizing that he had completely destroyed the interview. He had pushed too hard, been too mean, and crossed too many lines. And now, one of Hollywood's biggest stars had walked off his show, and millions of people had just watched it happen live. He tried to continue, picking up one of his scattered note cards from the floor. "So, we'll take a quick break and be right back with." But his voice trailed off. Nobody was listening anymore. The magic of the show was gone, broken by the ugly confrontation that had just played out. In the wings, crew members were gathered in small groups, whispering to each other. Some were checking their phones, already seeing social media explode with reactions to what had just happened. Others just stood there in shock, unable to believe that Graham had treated a guest that way. Back on stage, Graham sat down heavily in his chair. He looked tired suddenly, older. The confidence and charm he usually radiated had vanished completely. He had wanted to create a memorable moment, something people would talk about. Well, he had certainly succeeded. People would be talking about this for a very long time, but not in the way he had hoped. The audience was still mostly silent, with just a low murmur of confused conversation. They had come expecting laughs and fun stories. Instead, they had witnessed what would probably become one of the most controversial moments in talk show history. They had watched a host attack his guest, get called out for it, lose his temper, and watch that guest walk away with her dignity intact while he fell apart. One of the cameramen lowered his camera slightly, shaking his head. He'd been filming television for 20 years, and he'd never seen anything quite like this. Usually when things got tense, there were commercial breaks, or producers would step in, or people would laugh it off. But this had gone too far, too fast. There had been no stopping it. Graham stood up again, pacing back and forth across the stage. He was muttering to himself, occasionally looking toward the door where Meryl had exited. Part of him probably wanted to go after her, to apologize, to fix this somehow. But it was too late for that. The damage was done, and everyone had seen it. The stage manager finally approached him, putting a hand on his shoulder and speaking quietly in his ear. Graham nodded, but he didn't look at her. He just kept staring at the empty couch where Meryl had been sitting just minutes ago. The blue cushions still had a slight impression where she'd Saturday. Her microphone was still lying there, abandoned. Behind the scenes, Meryl was being escorted out of the building by her team. She didn't look back, didn't hesitate. She had said what needed to be said, and she had left on her own terms. Her phone was already ringing with calls from her agent, her publicist, and probably several news outlets. But she ignored them all, walking out into the night air and taking a deep breath. Back in the studio, Graham finally addressed the audience again. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice hoarse, I think we're going to end tonight's show early. I apologize for all of that." He gestured vaguely toward the couch, toward the door, toward the whole mess he'd created. Some audience members stood up immediately, ready to leave. Others stayed in their seats, still processing what they'd just witnessed. A few were already typing on their phones, sharing the story with friends and family. Within minutes, the whole world would know what had happened on Graham Norton's show tonight. Graham looked at the main camera one last time. "Thank you for watching," he said, but the words sounded hollow, empty. He turned and walked off the stage without another word, leaving the crew to figure out how to salvage the rest of the episode. The lights in the studio slowly dimmed, and the audience began filing out, talking in hushed, excited voices. They had come for entertainment, and they had certainly gotten the show. Just not the kind they expected. They had witnessed a Hollywood legend stand up to a bully, call him out on live television, and walk away with her head held high. And they had watched that bully crumble under the weight of his own behavior. As the last audience members left and the crew started packing up equipment, the studio felt strangely quiet. The energy that usually filled the space after a taping was gone, replaced by an uncomfortable heaviness. People worked in silence, avoiding eye contact, processing what had just happened. In his dressing room, Graham sat alone in front of his mirror. The makeup artist had left, the producers had stopped calling, and he was finally by himself. He looked at his reflection and barely recognized the angry, red-faced man staring back at him. This wasn't who he thought he was, or maybe it was, and he just hadn't wanted to see it before. Outside the studio, news vans were already arriving. Word had spread impossibly fast. A confrontation between Graham Norton and Meryl Streep, ending with her walking off the show, was the kind of story that spread like wildfire. Entertainment reporters were setting up cameras, preparing to broadcast the news to millions of viewers who hadn't even seen the show yet. The security footage would show Meryl getting into her car and driving away without looking back. She hadn't cried, hadn't seemed upset. She had simply left, removing herself from a toxic situation with grace and strength. That's what real power looked like. Not shouting, not throwing things, not grabbing people's arms, just the quiet confidence to say, "This isn't acceptable," and walk away. Meanwhile, social media was exploding. People who had been in the audience were posting their first-hand accounts. Others were sharing rumors, speculation, and opinions. The hashtag about the incident was already trending worldwide. Some people defended Graham, saying Meryl was being too sensitive. But far more people were on her side, applauding her for standing up to what they saw as bullying and ageism. The show's producers were in emergency meetings, trying to decide what to do. Should they release a statement? Should they edit the footage before it aired in other time zones? Should they apologize? Every decision they made in the next few hours would have massive consequences for the show, for Graham, and for everyone involved. But none of that mattered to Meryl. She was already home, having changed out of her blue dress and into comfortable clothes. She poured herself a glass of wine and sat on her couch, finally allowing herself to feel the emotions she had kept controlled during the confrontation. Not regret. She didn't regret standing up for herself. But sadness that it had been necessary. Frustration that even after all these years, she still had to deal with people who thought they could diminish her accomplishments or use her age as a weapon. Back at the studio, the lights were finally all turned off. The empty stage sat in darkness, the red couch looking almost ghostly in the dim emergency lighting. Tomorrow, people would try to move on, to pretend it hadn't been that bad, to minimize what had happened. But everyone who had been there would remember. They would remember the moment a talk show host forgot that treating people with respect should always come before entertainment. They would remember the sound of that microphone hitting the couch. And most of all, they would remember Meryl Streep walking away with her dignity intact, while Graham Norton's reputation lay in tatters on the studio floor.